I really appreciate the opportunity to address this school and to expand the collaboration the Socialist Equality Group in Brazil is developing with the International Committee of the Fourth International. I'll begin the lecture now. Around 1 month ago, last June, marked 60 years since the infamous Congress of Reunification between the Socialist Workers' Party, alongside its supporters in Latin America and Asia, and the Pabloite International Secretariat. The body established through that fusion, the United Secretariat, represented an international alliance of the petty bourgeoisie dedicated to overthrowing the program of the Fourth International, a program based on the exclusive and non-transferable role of the international working class in the abolition of capitalism. The resolution of that Congress of Renegades proclaimed that, I quote, "A new epoch in the history of the world revolution," end quote, began with the rise to power of a petty bourgeois nationalist movement in Cuba led by Fidel Castro. It assigned to Trotskyism the servile role of helping to, and I quote, "strengthen and enrich the international current of Castroism," end quote, both in the colonial countries and the metropolitan centers of capitalism. This attempt to dissolve once and for all the Fourth International was frustrated by the principled stance taken by the International Committee under the leadership of Jerry Healy and the Socialist Labor League, supported then by the French OCI. The struggle waged by the SLL between 1961 and 63 guaranteed the preservation of Trotskyism as a distinct international and historic political current. It is one of the great moments in the history of the Marxist movement. After 1953, major developments in the international class struggle had confirmed the critical character of the political differences that emerged in the struggle against Pabloism. In particular, the eruption of mass struggles in the USSR and the Eastern European countries against the rule of the Stalinist bureaucracy. Those struggles culminated in the Hungarian Revolution, which was brutally suppressed by the Soviet government in November 1956. That development powerfully vindicated the Trotskyist program of the political revolution defended by the SCFI against the revisions of Pabloism. Taking up the critical lessons from that experience, the British Trotskyists concluded that while, I quote, "the spontaneous development of the political revolution can carry it to a high level, the first examples of the political revolution in real life have also underlined the absolute necessity of a conscious leadership," close quote. The massacre in Budapest proved that the illusions fostered by the Pabloites in left-wing shifts by the bureaucracy under the pressure of the masses could only disarm the working class and prepare new bloody defeats. But the Pabloite International Secretariat reached the opposite conclusions. The growing crisis of Stalinism under the offensive of the working class had come to the fore earlier in 1956, as it was discussed earlier today, with the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The secret speech given by Nikita Khrushchev recognized that Stalin was a criminal, as the desperate bureaucracy sought to transfer the massive opposition it faced to a single individual. The Pabloites saw in those developments the realization of their prophecies about a peaceful self-reform of the bureaucracy and the growth of tendencies within it that represented the interests of the working class. The essential significance of the 1956 crisis, as David North wrote, I quote, was that it heralded a profound change in the world relation of forces between the Fourth International and the degenerate Stalinist bureaucracy, end quote. He continued, I am quoting the biography of Cliff Slaughter. As Labor Review had declared in January 1957, the Great Ice Age had come to an end. Objective conditions that favored the resolution of the historic crisis of leadership of the working class were now emerging. And it also were emerging that differences existed and were developing within the ICFI. In the responses to that major change in the political situation, it became clear that the critical differences were emerging within the IC itself. The British section of the ICFI, under the leadership of Healy, began a major political offensive among the working class, the youth, and intellectuals to clarify the history and nature of the Trotskyist struggle against Stalinism that was being vindicated. As North wrote in his biography of Jerry Healy, I quote, the power of the British Trotskyist intervention in the crisis of Stalinism was derived from the clarification which had been achieved through the struggle against Pabloite Revisionism. Precisely because the British section had rejected conciliation with and capitulation to Stalinism, Healy was able to achieve important breakthroughs within the Stalinist ranks, end quote. As a result of this campaign, the British Trotskyists reached a new and higher relationship to the working class and emerged as a powerful political tendency in Britain. These conquests took form in the foundation of the Socialist Labor League in 1959. A completely different attitude was taken by the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States. While the SWP analysis of the Hungarian Revolution and the Khrushchev speech had a principled character stemming from its recent international struggle against Pabloism, that line came into direct conflict with the increasingly opportunistic policies it had developed since '53. I quote, the protracted economic boom, the quiescence of the labor movement, the stranglehold of the bureaucracy over the unions, and the lingering effects of the anti-communist hysteria in the United States had built up enormous pressures on the cadre of the SWP, end quote. In contrast with the British Trotskyists, the practical response of the SWP to the crisis of Stalinism was the adoption of a regroupment policy, oriented to dissolving the party into the poisonous milieu of American middle-class radicalism. Instead of reaffirming the political principles separating the Trotskyist movement from bankrupt Stalinism, the SWP sought to attenuate those differences, to accommodate the repentant elements of the Stalinist bureaucracy. The essential significance of the proposals for a reunification of the ICFI and the International Secretariat of the Pabloites that emerged in that moment was synthesized by David North in The Heritage We Defend. I quote, "In the aftermath of 1956, the efforts of the Pabloites were directed to use a military analogy towards reinforcing the beleaguered forces of the weakened bureaucracy against the danger of an offensive by the revitalized forces of Trotskyism. The Pabloites responded to the crisis of 1956 by seeking, under the guise of reunification, that is, ending the split of 1953, to split the International Committee." End quote. It is actually a quote from the Slaughter's political biography. And if I can repeat, I think that that's a very important passage. The military analogy that David makes here. The significance of the reunification policy was reinforcing the beleaguered forces of the weakened bureaucracy against the danger of an offensive by the revitalized forces of Trotskyism. That was the meaning of the reunification policy being pressured by the Pabloites. The initial positions adopted by the SWP in relation to Hungary and the USSR could not in any way justify a reunification with the Pabloites. But its orientation towards that policy, I quote, was the organic expression of its capitulation to the pressures of hostile class forces within the United States, end quote. That's from The Heritage. In March 1957, without consulting its comrades of the ICFI, Cannon wrote a letter to the Sri Lankan centrists of the LSSP, accepting their demands for, I quote, an immediate unification of Trotsky's forces in all countries, end quote. The unprincipled basis of that move was made clear by Cannon's intentions to brush aside political differences and find a convenient agreement for a, quote, common political action, end quote. Healy's response to Cannon's opportunistic maneuver set the political grounds upon which the discussions between the British and the SWP over the reunification with the Pabloites would develop during the following years. In his May 1957 letter to Cannon, Healy shifted the emphasis from organizational grounds, claiming that such proposals could not overcome, I quote, the very deep-going political differences that exist with the Pabloites. Instead, Healy emphasized the need to develop the struggle initiated in 1953. He wrote, I quote, "The strengthening of our cadres is decisive in this present period, and this can only be done in a thoroughgoing education around the problems of revisionism," end quote. He concluded, "The British section will never agree to anything which may cut across essential clarification," end quote. A conference of the ACFI held in Leeds, in England, in June 1958, analyzed the new developments in the world situation, reaffirming the principles of its struggle against Pabloism. Answering the crisis of Stalinism, the conference's resolution stated that the ICFI's, quote, rejection of all conceptions that mass pressure can resolve the question of leadership by forcing reform of the bureaucratic apparatus, end quote. While admitting unity in action with the tendencies breaking from the bureaucracies, it demanded that it be coupled with an ideological offensive against Stalinism, social democracy, centrism, trade union bureaucracy, and the bourgeois and petty-bourgeois leaderships of national movements in colonial and semi-colonial countries, end quote. The resolution also rejected the conception being developed at that time by the Pabloites about a shift of the center of world revolution to the colonial countries. He declared, I quote, "The world revolution cannot take a decisive leap forward until it breaks through in the metropolitan countries. The counteroffensive of the workers in the metropolitan countries, on its turn, will spur the colonial revolution forward to new heights." End quote. The leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party rejected the conference's conclusions, revealing their opportunist conception of reunification with the Pabloites. They denounced those documents for reviving, I quote, "the discussion around 1953, which have been long superseded by events upon which there has been essential political agreement," end quote. These documents were also denounced by another political leader, Nahuel Moreno, who participated in the Leeds conference in the name of the Argentinian section. Moreno's contribution anticipated some of the critical issues that soon emerged with the Cuban Revolution. They revealed the class pressures that existed in Latin America and formed the basis of support for the reunification policy among its sections. The main proposal of Moreno was for the dissolution of each national section of the Fourth International in what he called, I quote, "revolutionary united fronts," based upon a whole new strategy for the epoch. This distilled Pabloite program was based on the following premises, I quote, "The crisis of the apparatus releases unconscious revolutionary tendencies. Its emergence has a deep objective meaning. It is the beginning of a new revolutionary leadership of the mass movement. It is a utopia to claim that the unconscious revolutionary tendencies that exist and will continue to exist in the workers' movement and in the colonial masses of the entire world are immediately or automatically incorporated into the Fourth International." End quote. These unconscious revolutionary tendencies, and not the party, would be responsible for carrying out, I quote Moreno again, "the most urgent revolutionary needs of the country, zone or union, university or intellectual group where we act," end quote. Upon his return to Argentina, Moreno reported his disagreements with the perspective of the Leeds conference in a report to other Latin American sections in January of 1959. Titled "Permanent Revolution in the Post-War," the report declared total opposition to the following paragraph of the Leeds resolution. I quote the paragraph. In the colonial and semi-colonial countries, our central task is to build revolutionary proletarian parties. Armed with the theory of permanent revolution, these will participate in united anti-imperialist fronts with the aim of establishing proletarian leadership of the masses. We reject all conceptions of subordinating the program of the social revolution to the limited aims of the bourgeoisie or the petty bourgeoisie, end quote. Moreno's disagreement with this formulation stemmed from his total opposition to the theory of permanent revolution. Under the guise of updating it, he presents a diametrically opposed conception of the historical development. I quote Moreno. The bourgeois democratic revolution and the socialist revolution were formally combined, closely linked, only in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. But today, we find that within the heart of the workers' revolution itself, in the metropolitan countries, the democratic revolution plays a role of first magnitude. It is intimately linked to the workers' revolution. The Negro problem in North America and that of the Algerians in France is the best example. England will not be an exception, and within 2 or 3 years will follow in the footsteps of France and North America. In England, we will have a racial problem posed directly or indirectly by imperialism with its economic crisis, end quote. The Cuban Revolution was the channel found by the Socialist Workers' Party for the complete revision of its program to match its opportunistic practice and its drive for reunification with the Pabloites. The course of that process gave rise to Joseph Hansen as the leading theoretician of the SWP. As the ICFI later found out, Hansen acted as an agent of the GPU and later of the FBI. He was a physical manifestation of the infiltration of the Trotskyist movement by conscious agents of hostile class forces. But the rise of Hansen's political authority expressed more deeply the SWP's capitulation to the ideological pressures of the petty bourgeoisie in the heart of imperialism. Once it abandoned the perspective of carrying out the socialist revolution in the United States, and it felt the need to break free from the shackles of Marxism to follow its opportunistic path, Hansen was the man for the job. The overthrow of Batista's dictatorship in 1959 by the 26th of July movement led by Fidel Castro was part of the whole series of anti-imperialist struggles and revolutions that emerged in the aftermath of the war. And while the SWP had initially characterized it as a bourgeois nationalist regime, in the course of 1960, it completely changed its line. As Castro's regime, pressed by intransigent demands by American imperialism, carried out a series of nationalizations and cemented its ties with the Soviet Union, Hansen claimed that it had established a worker state and was leading a socialist revolution in Cuba. The SWP argued that under the influence of the mighty force of new objective conditions, and I quote the SWP, the petty bourgeois leadership, beginning with a bourgeois democratic program, followed the dialectical logic of the revolution instead of the formal logic of their own program, and ended up establishing the first worker state in the Western Hemisphere and proclaiming it as an example for all of Latin America. End quote. Like Moreno, Hansen claimed to be simply updating the theory of permanent revolution. He argued that the automatic development of unconscious petty-bourgeois elements to the conclusion of the necessity of the socialist revolution was a vindication of Trotsky's theory. The core of such revision was to deny the conclusion established by the Russian Revolution and confirmed in the negative by the catastrophic experiments with the two-stage theory under the Stalinist leadership, that the petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry could play an independent political role in the epoch of imperialism. Directed at first to the colonial countries, its natural conclusion was that in the advanced countries too, the petty bourgeoisie could play a leading role. Once Castro, Guevara, and his colleagues were regarded as still political virgins who were still growing as conscious Marxists, Hansen came to declare Cuba as the only uncorrupted workers' regime in the world. By praising this man of action, who initiated a revolution without a preconceived plan, and by intuitively reacting to events, defeated capitalism and started the socialist transformation of society, the SWP declared the Leninist Party and the Fourth International useless tools. The SWP's characterization of the Cuban regime as a worker state carried vast implications for Marxist theory. They were carefully considered in the heritage we defend. I quote, in 1939 and 40, during the battle inside the SWP over the class nature of the Soviet state, Trotsky taunted the Burnham-Shachtman minority to explicitly state what strategic and programmatic conclusions were to be drawn from their proposed finding that the Soviet Union was no longer to be considered a worker state. In this way, he made clear that the struggle was not simply a dispute over terminology. The minority's rejection of the Fourth International's designation of the USSR as a worker state was inextricably connected to profound differences with Trotskyism on all fundamental questions. Similarly, the question of Cuba was not merely a difference over terminology. Hansen sought to evade the formulation of a principled explanation of the implications, both for Marxist theory and the program of the Fourth International, of the definition of Cuba as a worker state. He refused to state precisely what conclusions the Trotskyist movement ought to draw from the alleged formation of a worker state under the petty bourgeois non-Marxist leadership of Castro. And what were these implications? Continue to quote from the heritage we defend. If worker states could be established through the actions of petty bourgeois guerrilla leaders, based principally on the peasantry, who possessed no significant historical, organizational, and political connections to the working class, and under conditions in which there existed no identifiable organs of class rule through which the proletariat exercised its dictatorship, there then followed a whole new conception of the historical path to socialism, entirely different from that foreseen by Marxists. It implicitly rendered anachronistic Marx's writing on the Commune and Lenin's assessment of the universal significance of Soviet power as the new form of state power discovered by the proletariat, the first non-bourgeois type of state. The relevance of the strivings of generations of Marxists to organize the proletariat independently of other classes, including the oppressed peasantry, and to infuse the workers' movement with scientific socialist consciousness was being flagrantly challenged, end quote. The liquidationist conceptions developed by the SWP in its drive to reunification with the Pabloites had immense and disastrous consequences for the development of the Trotskyist movement in Latin America. It demanded that the Trotskyists in Cuba completely subordinate themselves to the, I quote, soon to be formed Unified Revolutionary Party, where they can work loyally, patiently, and confidently for the implementation of the fully revolutionary socialist program which they represent, end quote. Within short order, the Castro regime seized the printing press of the Cuban Trotskyists, smashed the typeset for a Cuban edition of Trotsky's Permanent Revolution, and imprisoned their leading members. Here we have a picture of Ramon Mercader, Trotsky's assassin, with Fidel's brother, Ramon Castro, received as a guest of honor in Cuba. Extending that criminal political orientation to the revolutionaries across that region of Latin America, the SWP's resolutions of 1962 declared, I quote, Trotskyists throughout Latin America should try to bring together all those forces, regardless of their specific origins, ready to take the Cuban experience as the point of departure for the revolutionary struggles in their own countries, end quote. Those pieces of advice were followed in a series of countries with catastrophic results. Preparing the dissolution of the Workers' Revolutionary Party of Chile into the movement of the revolutionary left, the MIR, which was an amalgam of middle-class tendencies, they adopted a resolution published by the SWP in its International Socialist Review of 1961. The resolution of the Chileans claimed, I quote, these developing militant currents tend to form movements that break out of the molds of the old centrist formations. In the final analysis, fostering revolutionary currents that want to carry things through once and for all a la cubana. The new forces, liberated by the impact of the Cuban Revolution, paved the way for regroupment of various revolutionary groups, of independent militant sectors, and of left tendencies, while splits occur among the centrist formations mentioned above. The task of the Trotskyists, consequently, is to encourage and to develop all these militant and intuitively revolutionary currents, at the same time backing every anti-imperialist mobilization, end quote. This liquidationist move left the Chilean working class without a Marxist leadership in a critical revolutionary situation that emerged in the coming years, causing its defeat and the assumption of power by the brutal Pinochet dictatorship in 1973. And here you have a picture also of Fidel Castro with Pinochet. Commenting on the SWP's opportunist perspectives for Latin America, the now completely demoralized Jim Cannon wrote to Hansen in 1961. I quote Cannon. Strangely enough, these definite proposals may conflict with some sectarian tendencies, not only of our own Latin American co-thinkers, but also of the Latin American Pabloites. But a clear and explicit statement of our position along the lines of the above proposals from the SWP, which has consistently defended the Cuban Revolution under the most difficult circumstances, should carry considerable authority. It might open the way for possibly better consultation and collaboration with the Latin American Trotskyists of both camps. End quote. I think this letter synthesizes the criminal role that the SWP played in the development of this liquidationist movement in Latin America. As he himself recognized by then, Cannon and his party had completely assumed the perspectives of Pabloism, in some cases more strongly than Pablo himself. By early 1961, the SLL took up a decisive step in the struggle against revisionism that put the Orthodox Trotskyists once again in the offensive. Writing to the leadership of the SWP in January of 1961, the SLL decisively refuted the attempt by the Americans to reduce the significance of the 1953 split to organizational problems. The British Trotskyists stated their commitment to the principles of Cannon's open letter and directly asked the American leadership if they still stood for it. Considering the meaning of Pabloism from the standpoint of the revolutionary tasks confronting the Trotskyist movement, the SLL declared, I quote, "It is because of the magnitude of the opportunities opening up before Trotskyism, and therefore the necessity for political and theoretical clarity, that we urgently require a drawing of the lines against revisionism in all its forms. It is time to draw to a close the period in which Pabloite revisionism was regarded as a trend within Trotskyism." End quote. In a follow-up letter dated May 8 of 61, the SLL confronted the revisionist line being developed about the Castro's regime. They declared that, I quote, "Even if the bourgeois revolution in Cuba has been forced by the US policy to step beyond the normal bounds of the social measures of a bourgeois revolution, this exceptional result of a particular situation," close quote, "did not justify any revision of the movement's definition of a worker state." The letter continued, "Even if Castro and his cadre were converted, would that make the revolution a proletarian revolution? If the Bolsheviks could not lead the revolution without a conscious working class support, can Castro do this? Quite apart from this, we have to evaluate political tendencies on a class basis, on the way they develop and struggle in relation to the movement of classes over long periods. A proletarian party, let alone a proletarian revolution, will not be born in any backward country by the conversion of petty bourgeois nationalists who stumble naturally or accidentally upon the importance of the workers and peasants. The dominant imperialist policymakers both in the USA and Britain, recognize full well that only by handing over power, that only by handing over political independence to leaders of this kind, or accepting their victory over feudal elements like Farouk and Nuri Said, can the stakes of international capital and the strategic alliances be preserved in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Close quote. They concluded, it is not the job of Trotskyists to boost the role of such nationalist leaders. As the SWP's leadership had already embarked on its one-way trip towards liquidationism, those terms were obviously unacceptable for them. But the British Trotskyists were committed to carrying out a patient struggle to clarify the international movement about the nature of the new political division that had clearly emerged. In the battle of ideas that followed over the next 2 years, the SLL had an important advantage. While the SWP saw their arguments as means to intimidate their opponents and to achieve their petty, immediate factional aims, quote, not a single solitary Trotskyist in all of Latin America would touch the SLL position on Cuba with a 10-foot pole, Hansen claimed. He and his comrades understood this theoretical fight as a critical part of the realization of the revolutionary historical aims. As Cliff Slaughter stated in the course of that discussion, I quote, in a period of revolutionary developments in the working class movement, the clearest and most incisive political line is the highest necessity. This line is only arrived at through conflict with incorrect conceptions to arrive at an accurate reflection of the real situation. It necessitates a fight against revisionism, which always reflects the pressure of the ruling class. This means a scientific study of the history of the movement itself, precisely in order to provide the revolutionary elements in the working class with an international Marxist strategy. It is necessary to fight to the end all revisionism, to understand our own present position as the product of such conflicts consciously resolved. End quote. With that spirit, the British Trotskyists celebrated when the Socialist Workers' Party, I quote, acknowledged explicitly the questions of principle which at that moment divide the SWP and the SLL in its document Problems of the Fourth International and the Next Steps, adopted by the SWP in June 1962. The SLL's response, presented in Trotskyism Betrayed, authored by Cliff Slaughter, declared that its basic differences in method with the SWP centered upon the basic questions of Leninism, how to proceed to the construction of an international revolutionary party. The SLL continued, I quote, the fact that a new stage has been reached in this discussion is itself part of a new stage in the construction of these revolutionary parties of the Fourth International, for which the defeat of revisionism is necessary. The document declared, the workers of the advanced countries are entering big struggles. This will result in lasting defeats unless they become struggles for state power, for which Marxist leadership is necessary. Apologies for the non-Marxist leaderships, assertions that petty bourgeois leadership can become Marxist naturally through the strength of the objective forces, this threatens to disarm the working class by disorienting the Marxist leadership. If capitulation to the centrists take place now, preventing the working class from breaking with the social democratic, Stalinist, and trade union bureaucracy, then the revisionists will have the responsibility for enormous working class defeats. End quote. Denouncing the SWP's renunciation of the thesis of the crisis of revolutionary leadership and its embrace of the same objectivist outlook of Pabloism, Slaughter wrote, quote, "Talk of the laws of history, accomplishing this as a process separate from the development of the party, is an abandonment of the Marxist position on the relations between objective and subjective. There must be a conscious construction of this party if the working class is to take power and build socialism." End quote. Explaining that the differences in relation to Cuba were only part of these general and fundamental disagreements, the SLL exposed the complete fraud of the SWP's claim that its characterization of Cuba as a worker state was a continuation of Trotsky's analysis of the Soviet Union. I quote, "Trotskyism betrayed." Trotsky insisted that his discussion and definition of the USSR were to be taken historically and in relation to the world struggle between the working class and the capitalist class. The SWP method is the opposite, taking certain criteria from the discussion of one particular manifestation of the revolutionary struggle in one part of the world as a unique stage in the development of the world revolution. They apply this criteria to another part of the world, a generation later, to a particular sector at a particular stage of the struggle. Thus, nationalization and the existence of workers' militias are sufficient to make Cuba a worker state and to make the Cuban Revolution a socialist revolution. This normative method is the theoretical cover for the practice of prostrating themselves before the present unstable and transitory stage of the struggle, the victory of the petty bourgeois revolutionary nationalists, instead of starting from the perspective and the tasks of the working class. End quote. The SLL asked, I quote, "What does a worker state mean in concrete terms? It means the dictatorship of the proletariat in one form or another. Does the dictatorship of the proletariat exist in Cuba?" We reply categorically, no. They continue. The Castro regime did not create a qualitatively new and different type of state from the Batista regime. The nationalizations carried out by Castro do nothing to alter the capitalist character of the state. End quote. And answering the claims by Hansen and the Pabloites that the development of Cuba was confirming the theory of permanent revolution, the document declared, I quote, "Cuba constitutes, in fact, a negative confirmation of the permanent revolution, where the working class is unable to lead the peasant masses and smash the capitalist state power, the bourgeoisie steps in and solves the problems of the democratic revolution in its own fashion and to its own satisfaction. End quote. Even at this point of the discussion, the SLL continued to maintain its proposal for the realization of principle discussions with the ranks of all international sections, including the Pabloites. They explain about that, I quote, it's also in Trotskyism Betrayed. Our intention in making these proposals is not to arrive at any summit agreement between the leading committees of the IC and the IS, but to carry on an unrelenting struggle against the revisionism throughout the ranks of all sections of both organizations. Attempting to isolate the SLL, Joseph Hansen responded to the British Trotskyists' principled attack with the text Cuba, the acid test, a reply to ultra-left sectarians in November of '62. Hansen's document was a vicious attempt to slander the SLL, painting its positions as an idealistic and dogmatic denial of objective reality. Hansen claimed, the world, I quote Hansen, sorry, the world Trotskyist movement has waited now 2 long and crowded years for the SLL to recognize the facts about the Cuban Revolution. Why this obstinate refusal to admit palpable events? Strangest of all, the leaders of the SLL have come to recognize that they are refusing to acknowledge the facts. They have converted this into a virtue and even elevated it into a philosophy. Close quote. Hansen was speaking here of the differentiation between Marxism and empiricism made by Slaughter in his Lenin on dialectics. In which Slaughter argued, I quote, that some Marxists assume that Marxist method has the same starting point as empiricism. That is to say, that it starts with the facts. It is worth quoting Slaughter at length. He continues, of course, every science is based on facts. However, the definition and establishment of the facts is crucial to any science. Part of the creation of a science is precisely its delimitation and definition as a field of study with its own laws. The facts are shown in experience to be objectively and lawfully interconnected in such a way that a science of these facts is a meaningful and useful basis for practice. Our empiricist Marxists in the field of society and politics are far from this state of affairs. Their procedure is to say, we had a program based on the facts as they were in 1848 or 1921 or 1938. Now the facts are obviously different, so we need a different program. It is a false and non-Marxist view of the facts, which leads to these revisionist ideas. What our objectivists are saying with this message, history is on our side, is this. Look at the big struggles taking place. Add them together without analyzing them. Go on your impressions on their significance and add all this together, and you have the facts. Colonial revolutions are successful here and successful there and in another place. Then the success of the colonial revolution is a fact. Nationalist leaders like Nkrumah and Mboya and Nasser make anti-imperialist speeches and even carry out nationalizations. This suggests that history is tending irreversibly and inexorably to force non-proletarian politicians in a socialist direction. But objectivism of this kind is a collection of impressions and not a rich dialectical analysis of the whole picture, with the parts related to one another. A truly objective analysis begins from the economic relations between classes on a world scale and within nations. It proceeds through an analysis of the relations between the needs of these classes and their consciousness and organization. On this, it bases its program for the working class internationally and in each national sector. A list of progressive forces is not an objective analysis. It is the opposite. That is, simply a collection of surface impressions, an acceptance of the existing unscientific consciousness of the contemporary class struggle as held by these participants, primarily by petty bourgeois politicians who lead the national movements and bureaucratized labor movements. To overlay this theoretical blunder by suggesting that Castro and others are natural Marxists serves only to confirm that the theorists concerned are little aware of how far they have gone. They seem to suggest that the periods of maximum revolutionary tension are those when the participants in mass struggle arrive easily and spontaneously at revolutionary concepts. On the contrary, it is precisely at such times that there is a premium on scientific consciousness, on the theory and strategy developed in struggle over a long period. End quote. The SLL utilized Hansen's defense of the empiricist method, falsely identifying empiricism systematically carried out to Marxism, to further expose the unprincipled character of the SWP's opportunistic policies. It revealed the historical and class foundations of the anti-Marxist philosophical method the SWP used as its basis. In March of 1963, the SLL published Opportunism and Empiricism, signed also by Slaughter. It declared, Hansen leads the tendency which calls for unification with a revisionist tendency on the basis of purely practical political agreement on immediate tasks. From this point of view, he rejects an examination of the history of the split and of the differences between the tendencies. What is the methodical basis of Hansen's approach here? The dominant question for him is always what will work best, asked always from the narrow perspective of immediate political appearances. End quote. The SLL laid down the fundamental differences separating Marxism from the objectivist method that united the SWP to the Pabloites. I quote, all this argument that the facts are the objective reality and that we must start from there is a preparation to justify policies of adaptation to non-working class leaderships. Empiricism, since it starts with the facts, can never get beyond them and must accept the world as it is. This bourgeois method of thought views the world from the standpoint of the isolated individual in civil society, instead of taking the objective situation as a problem to be solved in the light of the historical experience of the working class, generalized in the theory and practice of Marxism. It must take the facts as they come. They are produced by circumstances beyond our control. Marxism arms the working class vanguard in its fight for the independent action of the labor movement. Empiricism adapts it to the existing setup, to capitalism and its agencies in the working class organizations. End quote. The British Trotskyists had established the essence of the conception of the new reality that served as the basis for the reunification of the SWP with the Pabloites. It was the justification and adaptation to the bourgeois reality and continuation of the domination of the world by imperialism. As the reunification was consummate, Healy wrote a final letter to the National Committee of the SWP. As North observed, it provided, I quote, a scathing review of the fraud and deceit which attended the convening of the SWP Pabloite Reunification Congress. But it was in the concluding paragraphs of the letter that Healy's contempt for the political betrayal of the SWP found its most biting expression, end quote. By the way, it was from Jerry Healy's biography. Now I quote Healy's letter. Healy wrote, "Of course you have no time for the sectarian SLL. Our comrades in the ranks and in the leadership fight day in and day out against reformism and Stalinism in the best traditions of the Trotskyist movement. But they do not yet speak to the tens of thousands at public meetings like Ben Bella, Castro, and the so-called Ceylon May Day meeting. In your eyes, we are merely small, ultra-left fry. It took you some time. As the saying goes, those who come late to Christ come hardest. It is approximately 12 years since George Clark joined forces with Pablo and published the message of the infamous Third Congress in the Militant, and what was at that time the magazine Fourth International. You failed to understand Pablo at that time, and then we had a split of 1953. Cannon hailed this split with the words that we were never going back to Pabloism. Until recently, he has been a really stubborn convert to Pabloism. But at last, you have made it. You now have allies all over the place, from Fidel Castro to Philip Cunhavardin and Pablo. We want to say only one thing, and in this, our Congress was unanimous. We are proud of the stand which our organization has taken against such a disgraceful capitulation to the most reactionary forces as that to which the majority leadership of your party has fully succumbed. End quote. Now 60 years have passed. What is left of the new forces and the blunted instruments? These facts that the SWP and the Pabloites claimed had overcome the fundamental pillars of the Fourth International. They have proved themselves completely unable to free either their own countries or any other part of the world from capitalism. Obeying the fundamental laws of permanent revolution already verified by Trotsky, those bourgeois and petty bourgeois leaderships have betrayed and disarmed the working class, preparing the path for fascistic military dictatorships and for the reestablishment of balance of imperialism. The political price of the Pabloite opportunism was paid in the blood of hundreds of thousands of youth, workers, and peasants that either followed their orientation to disastrous guerrilla struggles or were victimized by the defeats that it produced. Thank you, comrades.